Welcome everybody to the Masters Conference virtual webinar series. Today's topic is preparing and responding to cyber incidents. Today's webinar is brought to you by Consilio. My name is Bruce Malter. I'm one of the directors on the Masters Conference and a legal technology consultant. The Masters Conference is a boutique educational forum where a select group of speakers, vendors, and attendees convene to engage in proactive collaboration on current challenges within the legal space. We will be getting started shortly with today's program in just a moment, but before we get started, just a few housekeeping details. Today's program is being recorded and will be available on the Masters Conference YouTube channel within about a week. We encourage you to ask questions along the way. And we will carve out a little time at the end for some Q&A if we have the time. The content is for educational purposes only, does not constitute any legal advice. Questions posed by and opinions offered by participants are for the sole purpose of improving our educational value and do not constitute legal advice. The views expressed by the members of the panel belong solely to the panelists themselves and do not represent the views or opinions of their organizations. There are no bad questions. Again, we will be taking questions throughout the presentation, so feel free to DM any questions in the chat questions Masters Conference. And one more thing, and after a 2-year COVID hiatus, the Masters Conference will be back and live in person with conferences this year in DC, Chicago, Denver, Dallas, New York, Atlanta, and Southern California. So please keep an eye out for the dates and locations. The Consilio website is under a little bit of reconstruction, so hopefully within the next month, everything will be up to date and real nice and clean. Now on to our program. I would like to introduce our 3 panelists today. First, Bruce Radke, a shareholder and co-chair of Polsinelli's Privacy and Incident Response Practice. Karla Ballesteros, a member of the Breach Counsel Response Service team at Beazley, and James Jansen, Senior Director, Cyber Review Solutions at Consilio. I will pass this along to Bruce now to begin the presentation.
Great. Thank you, Bruce, and welcome everyone. It's as I saw people were signing in, it's good to see some very familiar faces. So want to talk to you about cyber incidents, and one of the principal types of cyber incidents that we are seeing in terms of frequency and also the impact upon organizations is ransomware. And so we want to focus on that, but a lot of the things that we're talking about relative to ransomware can be readily applied to any type of incident, whether it's business email compromise or system misconfiguration, or just pretty much any kind of incident. Bruce, next slide, please. So on the slide here is a number of large-scale ransomware attacks that we have seen just recently. And the reason we put that up is obviously this have made headline news, but 2 things. One is that it has really driven an issue that was principally IT focused, right, around cybersecurity. It is made more of a board level issue. So given the impact upon ransomware incidents that they could have on organizations in terms of shutting organizations down, senior level management and also boards are now getting very much involved, as they should, in terms of what are we doing to prepare for a potential ransomware incident and how are we going to respond to an incident. Also, although we've listed a number of very large scale incidents, that does not necessarily mean that the threat actors are necessarily targeting larger organizations. And maybe James, Karla, do you want to speak to just kind of the scope of the organizations that you're seeing that have been hit with ransomware incidents?
Yeah, happy to take that. So as a first responder at Beazley, we see a wide range of insureds being impacted, from the mom and pop shops to doctors' offices, law firms, to larger scale industries. But it varies. I mean, I think it's safe to say everyone is a target, and so that's sort of what I've been seeing on my end.
Yeah, and I would say it's very, very similar. And I've seen, I think over the last several, at least the last year, there has seemed to be an uptick, particularly with organizations in the healthcare space. And those particular organizations, big and small, even the smaller organizations, when they have an incident, it can be, can have a significant impact on their operations, and can be very costly.
Next slide, please, Bruce. So the ransomware variants come really in a whole bunch of varieties, and there are numerous threat actor groups that have developed their own toolkit for getting into a network, conducting reconnaissance, and then eventually deploying the ransomware variants. And to a large measure, those don't have publicly available decryption keys. And therefore, what would happen is that they will look and identify not only active files, but also your backups, and encrypt both files, essentially shutting the business down. On the threat actor groups, a large number of those tend to be Russia and Eastern European, or generally foreign groups, and they constantly reconstitute themselves. So you may have an organization that authorities may have shut down. They may reconstitute themselves under a different name. And one of the things that they have been doing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, is not only encrypting files, but also exfilling files. Karla, James, anything on just kind of the threat actor groups in general?
I think another thing that we've been seeing is threat actors playing whack-a-mole. They will be taken down, or their operations will splinter off. And so we'll get variants of different ransomware variants. They'll switch names, especially if, government's starting to catch on to them, or, people are getting wise to their tactics. So they'll always try to switch it up. And it could be that they are the same exact threat actor, just under a different name.
Bruce, next slide, please. So this is a slide from Coveware, one of the vendors that we oftentimes work together to engage in ransom negotiations with threat actors, and if need be, to make those payments. And this is a pie chart of the types of industries that are affected. And as James mentioned before, healthcare is a large number, as well as, believe it or not, professional services. So be it law firms, accounting firms, real estate. So, basically this point is that every industry is potentially vulnerable here. Next slide, please.
The only thing I will add, Bruce, is these threat actors tend to go after data-rich targets. So professional services tend to be data-rich, and that includes law firms, small practices that may have healthcare information. So dentist practices would fall under those. So that is one trend that we've been noticing.
We've also seen an uptick in especially during what I would say professionals in tax season. We're in tax season now, but CPA organizations, they've got a lot of social security numbers, a lot of financial account information for their clients. And that, to your point, Karla, is very attractive to these threat actors.
Yeah, particularly now when we're getting into tax season, it presents a whole host of problems that if you've got a April 15th deadline and the accounting firm gets hit with ransomware and all their files are encrypted, then what do you do? And obviously, the point of doing ransom attacks is to add increased pressure upon the intended target. So, having an accounting firm that has their files that are encrypted and dealing with an April 15th deadline, it provides a significant amount of stress on that organization, potentially increasing the chances of them making a ransom payment. So, and also kind of the same thing with professional organizations, with law firms, and also those organizations that are dealing from a position of trust, letting their clients know that something has happened makes them potentially more inclined to pay the ransom. So, ransomware can be deployed in many different ways. One of the most common forms is through email. Emails that will be sent out to everyone in your organization that will have an attachment that you click on, and a macro will be enabled that may deploy the ransom or allow the threat actor to get into your network to then conduct reconnaissance, find out what endpoints are there, where the repositories of information reside, and then eventually deploy that ransomware. Another place is through various types of RDPs, remote desktop protocols, essentially vulnerabilities into your network that the threat actors will identify. It's an interesting kind of marketplace where there are certain threat actors who will only scan the web and find vulnerabilities within networks, and then they will turn those vulnerabilities or sell those vulnerabilities on the dark web to somebody else who will purchase that, use those vulnerabilities to actually get access to an organization's network, and then actually deploy the ransomware. It's a fairly sophisticated network in terms of information sharing on the threat actor side. There's also instances in which there's software vulnerabilities, that can be exploited by the threat actors. On this front, it's very important to stay current on your patches. The threat actors track when patches or when vulnerabilities have been identified, and then also will use that as kind of a roadmap in terms of their attacks. The other vulnerability that has happened it's more of a recent trend, and that is with MSP and IT providers. So Sobieski last year, and then the Kaseya more recently, and that is that the threat actor will identify a third-party provider that provides services to a number of different organizations, get access to that provider, deploy malware to that provider, which as part of regular updates will push that malware out to all their customers, which is pretty, if you think about it, pretty sophisticated and pretty smart, in the sense by attacking one system, the threat actors can impact multiple systems rather than just a single organization. Karla, James, any further thoughts on deployment?
I will say they are sophisticated in their tactics, and at the end of the day, they view themselves as a business, and so they have a thing that they call ransomware as a service. Well, they will lend out their encryption tools just to get some money out of that final ransom payment. And sometimes when they target third-party vendors, they don't themselves realize the full extent of its implications or its impact. So you can be hit with a ransomware because a client or didn't realize how interconnected your network is with your third-party service provider.
I think the other thing that I would mention, and many folks may know this already, is that the threat actors, when they don't necessarily gain access to your system and then hit immediately, right? They may be in your system for an extended period of time, watching the way that you operate. I think, Bruce, that you said looking for additional points of vulnerability and how they can access certain points of your system. So, you may hear, a ransomware attack may become active at some point, but the threat actor could have been in your system for a much longer period of time.
Bruce, next slide, please. One of the additional threads that we were seeing back in the what I would say good old days, many years ago, you would have the threat actors would simply come in, identify your active files and your backup, and encrypt both. And as a result, this is kind of an arms game, right? So every time the threat actor does something, we take a response, and the threat actor does something else. So in response to those, encrypting both active and backup files, organizations began to segment their backups and segment their networks such that they had those backups readily available, that they didn't need to necessarily purchase the decryption key in order to restore their systems and get back up and running. So as a result, the threat actors then turn to exfilling data. So again, what they will often do would get into your systems, enumerate your network to find out what systems have sensitive data. They will navigate around throughout your systems in a very stealthy way, and then deploy tools that would allow them to extract that data from your network. And at that point in time, they will then possibly deploy the ransom to encrypt your files. And sometimes they may not. They may simply exfil the data and leave your files intact. Kind of varies. And what they typically do then is they will say, if you don't pay me X number of millions of dollars, we will post that either on their own public shaming site or some other publicly facing site. Karla, any further thoughts on that, on exfil?
Yes, and it poses a lot of problems. From a state legal notification obligations, you may have to notify. Bruce can talk about this a lot more, but OCR presumes a breach, and so it would be up to an organization to combat that presumption if data was impacted. We are seeing more and more that there's no more encryption, there's only exfiltration, and so when it comes to negotiating a ransom payment, and we have a couple slides on that later on, but that poses an issue of whether or not it's in your interest to pay a ransom demand. You're paying for data suppression and not for a decryption key. You technically have access to your encryption if you can to your data. If you can get back up and running, that's great, but you still have either business reputation loss to be aware of. If business information is posted, trade secrets can be posted, or client or employee information, and so you want to protect yourself on all fronts. And so that's where working with Beazley, working with Consilio, figure out what data was actually taken from the threat actor, and working with Bruce's team, Polsinelli, to figure out what obligations you have depending on the data that was impacted.
Yeah, and to Karla's point, these are much more dynamic, what I would say, types of matters. We're reacting to what the threat actor is doing. So while Bruce is readily communicating with the threat actor, there's talking about strategically what with Karla about what you're going to do. Also, what's happening is that you're trying to also gain access to the data that the client is, or that the threat actor is posting to their website, right? So you're trying to pull that data down so that you can data mine that to see what files the threat actor is posting to the web, what sensitive information may be in there, and then dynamically reacting to that, because it's not you don't just have a set of a static set of data that you're dealing with. They can be updating that website with new data all the time, and you want to be proactive about pulling that down as they post new data and analyzing it, so you can be prepared to deal with what you need to, how you need to respond.
Yeah, and one kind of real life situation, I was just on the call with a client this morning, really illustrates this, right? So as you're thinking about whether or not we are going to make a payment for data suppression, right? One of the key questions is, how important is that data? So I had a client today that had 330,000 files that were uploaded by the threat actor group. And the question is, what is in those files? And we think it could be some employee data. We think it could be some of our customers' data. It could be some of our customers' employee data. So having the ability to very quickly identify what information is in those files, you may not know specifically, but having an understanding of what generally is in those files will help you make some determination as to whether or not you would even consider making payment for data suppression. One thing that I do want to emphasize, and that is if you have a situation in which sensitive data, social security numbers, have been acquired by the threat actor, the fact that you go ahead and make the payment, the ransom payment to the threat actor so that that information will not be posted on the threat actor's site, that does not obviate the need to notify those individuals whose sensitive information was acquired by the threat actor, such that if you have an acquisition of sensitive information, the fact that you have paid the ransom doesn't eliminate your legal obligation to notify folks whose information may have been impacted.
And
please.
I'll interrupt, but I do want to make sure we remind people that you can ask questions in the chat. And I'll have a question for Bruce is how often are we actually seeing data suppression or payment for data suppression work? Is it worth it?
So I would say it really in two instances, right? And myself, I think the instances in which you're paying for data suppression is pretty low, given the fact that you're going to have to notify the individuals whose information was compromised, right? So what's kind of the benefit of doing it? The two principal cases where we see it is number one, where the information is extremely sensitive. So we've had instances in which we've had trade secrets, or we had customer lists that were so sensitive that the fact that the customer lists were out there on publicly facing site, that in and of itself, even though it may not have been sensitive information, social security numbers, that having that information available would be extremely detrimental. Think of kind of the formula of Coke, something along those lines. The other instances in which we see is when we have businesses that customer information has been acquired and the threat actor is making claims that they will post that information. From a business perspective, the business who has had the ransom attack that involved customer information, they are looking at loss of business, reputation harm, and in those instances, some of those additional business decisions may tend to increase the likelihood that you would pay for data suppression. Karla, welcome your thoughts, and if you're kind of seeing the same thing too.
I agree, and I have seen instances where that is the case, and insureds have made payment to suppress data. I think the only thing I'll caveat, and I've heard Kovler say this after every single call when it comes to payment for data suppression, is you're paying a criminal at the end of the day. So they do, they are a business and they want to quote unquote stay in business and have good faith that if you pay them, they will not sell your data or post it on a dark web. But they're also fickle characters. And so payment is not a guarantee that they will not at the end of the day either turn around and sell your data or post it on the dark web just because they felt like it.
Which kind of raises the next point, and Bruce, if you would advance the slide one more. So, let's say we get to the point where either we need to make the payment because our active and backups are encrypted, or the information is so sensitive that we're paying for data suppression. We can't have it out there. The next question is, can we make the payment? And to a large measure is yes. There are certain instances in which you are legally not able to, and that is for you are unable to make payments to individuals on the OFAC list. And those are folks, state-sponsored actors like Iran, North Korea, and Syria, and also terrorist organizations. The important part about this is, and there is a list, the OFAC list, that you can go and look to see if the threat actor that you would potentially be making payments are on the prohibited OFAC list. The important thing about this is the last bullet point here, and that is that if you do make a payment to an organization on the prohibited list, that there is strict liability, not only civil, but also there could be criminal penalties that may result if you make payments to the threat actor group on the prohibited OFAC list. And Bruce, next slide, please. And in September of last year, Department of Treasury, Office of Foreign Assets and Control, that's OFAC, released some updated advice on when payment should be made and some of the other mitigating factors. So one of the things that, again, they reemphasize the fact that this is a strict liability statute. So if you make the payments, you are at risk. But also, they mentioned that anyone who was involved in the payment, and not just the organization making the payment, but everybody else involved in facilitating the payment could also be potentially at risk. So that means law firms, insurers, ransom negotiation payments, banks. And so now as a result, there are a number of additional hurdles that needs to be undertaken before such a payment would be made. Why is that important? Obviously, it's the more hurdles that are in place, which there should be, but it also may take some time in order to get from negotiating a number with a threat actor to actually making the payment. Your bank may need to get a certification from you or your counsel saying that the threat actor is not on the OFAC list. And then also, if you are going to make the payments as part of one of the mitigating factors, you want to notify law enforcement and let them know that the payment has been made. Karla, from an insurance side, maybe talk about ransom payments and how that works as well. Because I think a lot of times, it's a question of concern and folks really don't understand how that process works.
So I'll start with, I encourage everybody who has cyber insurance to get familiar with their cyber insurance carrier and their policies. If you don't have cyber insurance, I encourage you to get cyber insurance. But from getting to know your cyber insurance carrier and their policies, it will take a weight off of learning all of this process in a not high stakes situation. So as a first responder, when insureds are dealing with ransomware events, explaining OFAC, explaining sanctions and sanctioned entities, while their systems are encrypted, while they are not operating, while they are aware that personal information can be impacted, is incredibly stressful, and it's a lot to take in during a high stakes situation. So we do our best to sort of walk insureds through the process. One thing, from an insurance perspective, and I know Bruce touched on this, Beazley could potentially be sanctioned as well if we were to cooperate or facilitate payment to any sanctioned entity. And so we take a lot of precautions on our end to ensure that that's not the case. We work with Bruce and his team, make sure that there's an OFAC diligence report attached to any consideration to payment. We also require prior consent to any ransom payment. So we do our own internal sort of compliance checklist and ensure, but I definitely encourage people to ask questions before an incident arises sort of on this. And if you are impacted by a sanctioned entity, we try our best to connect you with different resources to try to find a workaround to get you back up and running. And that may just be notifying people, recovering you from your latest backups, but it's a liability not only for insurance carriers, for law firms, forensics, but for the impacted organization itself.
And Karla, do you want to maybe talk, just again, not to go too far down in the weeds, but just kind of the mechanics of the payments? I think a lot of folks are kind of somewhat surprised whenever you do, you bring in, well, let me take a step back and then I'll tee this up for Karla. So on the payment, and that is, oftentimes you get a ransomware matter that comes in. The ransom note in and of itself will not include the amount of the ransom demand. So you would need to reach out, and I strongly recommend that you don't do that yourself. This is not a situation that you want to kind of learn by doing. You want to bring in the folks who, professionals. One of the folks that we have worked with and who is on the Beazley panel, for example, is Covert. They're excellent, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But they'll reach out to the threat actor, and then we'll get the demand. And then there'll be some discussions amongst kind of the team, right? You, Covert, your insurer, the law firm, and figure out, okay, is this do we need to make a payment? 2, is this information sufficient of criticality that we need to either, get the decryption key to restore our systems, or is it so important that we need to pay for data suppression? And then how quickly do we need to have this information, right? And then based upon that, they'll come up with a strategy about making payments and the negotiation strategy. And eventually you'll come up with an amount that you're potentially willing to pay. Once you reach that agreement with a threat actor, then payment will have to be made. And maybe Karla, if you can kind of talk about how that happens, because I think some folks are a little surprised on kind of the next steps. So.
Yeah, and I will say, Beazley doesn't take a stance on whether or not a ransom demand should or should not be paid. We're just here as a ear and to, advise on certain coverage under your policy. But when it comes to paying a ransom demand, and if you're at that point of settling, and I'll take it a step back, we loop in Coveware mainly because I think some people, and I know there's a lot of people on this panel who are experienced or participating on this call who are experienced, but it's generally paid in cryptocurrency. I've had insureds be like, I'll send them a check. And that's not how a ransom payment is made. It's cryptocurrency. And if you don't have a Bitcoin wallet or you're not familiar with that process, it's generally best to leave it up to the experts. Coveware can negotiate and facilitate that crypto payment on your behalf. But if you're getting ready to make a payment, like I said, Beazley requires certain due diligence. A prior written consent is required on our end. So, for example, if an insured it reached an amount, it's letting Bruce and Bruce's team and Beazley's team know that this is the amount that you want to pay. Again, all we will say is coverage applies or coverage will not apply. And so it's assessed on an individual basis.
And oftentimes, you will be, depending upon your carrier, and you will be asked to make that payment up front, and then you will be reimbursed later on by the carrier. Let me pause just before we kind of move into another large topic and see if there's any other kind of questions. Bruce, is there any questions in the queue? Maybe.
Nope, no questions in the queue.
Yeah, and for everyone, feel free to chime in if you do have questions.
Bruce, can I ask a question as part of the audience?
Sure.
So in thinking about having a crypto wallet, most organizations probably, that's not something they probably have. Do you and maybe Karla as well, if you've seen this, do you recommend that if you have cyber insurance to sort of be prepared that lining up either having some cryptocurrency or at least having a vendor lined up it makes a lot of sense?
I'll go with, I recommend having vendors lined up, not necessarily having the crypto wallet, mainly because we'd want to ensure you're still following and adhering to the OFAC due diligence guidance. And so having a Bitcoin wallet could encourage certain insureds to make that payment because it's a lot easier. But that negotiation process done by Covert is still valuable as they have experience negotiating with them and driving down costs. So that would be my recommendation.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that when ransomware first started, well, let me take a step back. We've been doing this, for over 18 years. And one of the things that, we are constantly preaching is be ready, have your vendors ready, reach out to the forensic vendor, reach out to the restoration firm, reach out to the ransom negotiator. And I think, those requests may have been not as impactful as they have been in the last couple of years, given the frequency and the impact of ransomware. And as I mentioned before, this is now at the board level. So I think a lot of folks who understand the potential gravity of the situation are being much more proactive in terms of reaching out to their carriers and asking, okay, who would be the vendors that would be available to us if we do have an incident, and then through their carriers reaching out to the forensic firms and all the other vendors. I strongly recommend that you do that. And in fact, we've seen that happen more and more frequently for a number of reasons. Number one is, you know who you're going to be dealing with. You can vet some of those folks. You may want to have some calls with a number of different forensics firms, a number of different law firms. And so you don't have to do that kind of literally in the breach in the moment. You can take some time. You can look at terms and conditions of MSAs and negotiate those in a place where you don't have to just accept that terms and conditions. And also it provides, us on our end, an opportunity to get to know you, get to know your systems, and get to know your processes, so that we can be better at helping you get through an incident. And even more so if you can do a mock tabletop exercise. So reaching out to those folks is absolutely necessary. And one other thing in terms of an advantage of cyber insurance, and that is a lot of times, particularly when we have a large number of third-party incidents that impact a large number of organizations, those ransom negotiators may get extremely busy. There have been instances in which, just given the volume of ransomware attacks, some of those ransom negotiators aren't available. So I know as part of, the relationship with Beazley and Covor, one of the great things about having being a Beazley insured, you have access to Covor, and that's so they're going to be there when you need them. So. Bruce, maybe next slide, and maybe talk about, okay. So the question here is, question is, how has the decision not to pay a ransom to buy silence paid out in subsequent third-party litigation? Great question. I think this could cut both ways, right? So on one hand, you can make the argument that we did not pay because the information was not so critical, and the risk of harm to individuals was fairly low, right? And that's an argument that you might be able to make in subsequent litigation. The flip side is, hey, you allowed this information to be accessible. There was potential identity theft, and therefore it increases your potential liability. I think, candidly, it's one of those things you need to kind of look at on a case-by-case basis in terms of what information there is, how much information there are, and kind of what is the potential legal risk, particularly as it relates to different types of industries. But Karla, James, welcome your thoughts on that as well.
I agree, and I think that's also a consideration taken by our claims team with regards to evaluating, in the first instance, allowing somebody to pay for data suppression.
Maybe, and thank you, Marissa, for the question. Feel free to anyone else to chime in. Just talking about responding to ransomware attacks. So next slide, please, Bruce. Perfect. Yep. So there's essentially 4 phases, 5, in terms of a ransomware attack, or in fact, any kind of data incident. So number 1, mitigation or remediation, conducting the investigation as to what happened, what information may have been impacted, and then to the extent that you do have compromise of sensitive information, notification to individuals and regulators. Next slide, please, Bruce. So we talked about before about how ransomware is typically deployed. Here are a couple ways in which you find out that you have been the target of a ransomware attack. You have files that are not accessible. You have files that are missing, or you have other kind of alerts on your antivirus, or if you have a third party that is monitoring your network, if they're seeing large volumes of information being flowing out of your network, or if they start seeing different types of tools being deployed into your network. And then obviously if you get a ransom note. One of the, on the last part, these threat actors are very good at what they do, right? And some of them have a little bit of a swagger. We had an incident about a year ago in which public utility out west, that the threat actor had been in the network for some time and obviously done the reconnaissance and figured out who was involved in their cybersecurity, identified the CIO, and sent, oddly enough, he still had a fax machine, sent a ransom note to the CIO at his personal fax machine, which was kind of a little bit of an in-your-face kind of thing. But it kind of goes to the point that these guys are very, very good at what they do. Next slide, Bruce. Oh, go ahead, Karla. Sorry.
No, just adding on to that, I think that's been increasing more and more within these past few months. It's not only notes left on your system, they're calling CEOs. So, an employee may have seen the ransom note, thought nothing of it, deleted it. These ransom groups are now not only calling CEOs, board members, shareholders, they're also contacting clients if they have a hold of a client list. So they want your attention, and and sometimes, they are relentless.
Yeah. Karla, that's a really good point. And I think that's a trend that we have started seeing. And I think we're going to see more, because the whole notion is they are taking steps to continue to increase that pressure on you to make you more inclined to make that payment. So I think we are, right? Particularly when they've got information that they've exfilled, we've seen situations in which they've taken client list and gone out and started contacting clients or employees. So I think we're going to see that the increase of that. So great point. Kind of the next step, and you see that ransomware is deployed. What do? Right? So the whole thought is to contain the fire and eventually put out the fire. So at this point, a lot of that initial steps you may be doing on your own. But if you get to that point, and if you've never handled a prior incident before, this would be the time in which you want to reach out to your cyber insured, to Karla. And Karla, in turn, can get the right resources at the ready to help you contain and remediate the situation. And maybe, Karla, if you want to talk quickly about kind of the vendors and how everyone kind of gets together and to contain and put out the fire. So
yeah. So like I said, I'm a quote unquote first responder at Beazley. I am the first person, along with members of my team, who will get in contact with you to figure out what kind of incident you have going on. So a lot of the times, we'll get calls ranging from, I'm having trouble connecting to my server, and that's a very broad, general, thing to say. It could be internet connectivity issues. It could be all types of things. But then we start seeing general patterns. So, I'm having trouble connecting to X server. I'm having trouble connecting to certain files within that server. Certain things are now being encrypted. I keep getting an error message. There's this note that I don't understand, and it just has a link. So you may not know that that's a ransomware incident, but flags are going off in my head saying, oh no, this may be a ransomware incident. And so part of my role is try to get that high level overview of what's going on and figure out what services are applicable. And so I say services in a large umbrella term, but they vary from, privacy counsel, forensics. And so for ransomwares, it's always going to be three key players. It's going to be privacy counsel, cloaking, a forensic investigation under attorney-client privilege. And then if data is ultimately impacted, they will advise on any notification obligations. And then the forensics team, is there to help contain the situation, remediate, and figure out what data or what lateral movement was there stemming from an incident. And then Coveware is one of our vendors that we work with to negotiate and reach that potential settlement for ransom payment. And so it's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. So I will reiterate, if you get some familiarity working with them, you'll be comfortable, at the day and I knock on wood and hope I never have to speak with you, but on the day that you have an incident, because it can be overwhelming with how many people we do have on a call. And so Bruce, I don't know if you can speak to this, but I've had more and more now insureds who have to answer to their board of directors or their shareholders. And this could be a stressful situation when you're still trying to figure out what is going on.
Yeah, Karla, absolutely. I think that's becoming more, and again, because it's become higher profile in the news, board, senior management is becoming more attuned to it. And I think, one of the things that's a little frustrating is, we can assemble a team for pretty quickly, but it does take some time in order to investigate the incident, to find out whether data has been compromised. If you get decryption keys, and maybe Bruce, if you can go to the next slide, even if you get the decryption keys, it's going to take some time in order to push out the decryption keys in order to get your systems back up and running. And I think one of the things that is maybe frustrating, maybe a little surprising to senior management and the board who don't deal with this all the time, just it does take some time, right? And you may be working, everyone may be working 24/7, but it does take some time in order to kind of get back up and running. And Karla mentioned a lot of these folks on this list of folks who would be involved. One of the other things I would like to mention is if you do have to get a decryption key because your active and backup systems are encrypted, that might be a situation in which you don't have the ability to push out those keys and get those systems back up and running. So you may also need another vendor to come in and help you do those restoration efforts as well. Another vendor that you may see is PR and crisis management. Right? Your business may be down. Oftentimes we represent financial institutions that their customer portal or their online banking system is down because they've been hit with ransom, and folks can't transact business. And so they're asking questions. Hey, what's going on? This is impacting my business. We've had instances in which transportation companies have been hit with ransomware and they can't, literally transport goods. And so bringing on a PR and crisis management firm to help you manage and respond to all those external inquiries as well as internal inquiries may also be an appropriate depending upon the nature and the impact of the incident.
And I'll add a couple more that I think people don't realize are also involved: credit monitoring services, notification, call center, and of course, Consilio's involvement in a lot of figuring out what data was impacted. So there's a long list of vendors that we have to loop in. And from an insurance perspective, that increases costs.
Yeah, and one thing I'll note as well is that particularly on the forensic investigation side, I know from the jump, internal IT, they're trying to figure out what's going on, right? An organization's IT team is trying to solve the problem, close the vulnerability, and they may not have the level of expertise that that is necessary to do the work. It's not necessary, it's not that they don't have great people working on their data security and on their IT infrastructure. It's that there's a special skill set, particularly on the forensic side of things. And some of that work that your IT team may be doing to help to try to remediate the situation early on may actually make it more difficult for the forensic vendor to do their analysis, to determine what information was impacted, where the threat actor was in your system. And so that has, to Karla's point about the cost of bringing in these resources, when you've sort of wiped away a lot of the evidence that might be available to your forensic vendors, the downstream costs can become more expensive because you can no longer, for example, limit the amount of data that you might be data mining or looking for sensitive information. You may then have to look at everything on your network because you're not able to narrow in very specifically on what the threat actor had access to.
Yeah, James, which is a great segue. And I kind of want to get, what happens if we do have a situation like I was dealing with this morning, where we've got 330,000 files, right, that may contain sensitive information, or the forensic firm, given limitations of logs, can't, with a fair degree of certainty say these are the particular files on the server that may have been accessed and exfilled. How do you deal with that huge data set in terms of figuring out what information is in there and whose information is in there? Could you talk to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is really, again, this is in conjunction with Bruce and his team, is formulating what I would say is a reasonable and a defensible approach to the particulars of the incident. We're not, the idea is not to comb through every document one by one. We want to take a strategic and a targeted approach. And that means leveraging, analytics, and that can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different, depending on the data types that you're dealing with. But trying to target the documents or the records within a client's impacted data set that have the highest probability of having sensitive information. That can mean, using a file tree that's provided by the client to allow us to target specific network shares. If you have an HR file share, that's an area where you're going to want to go because you're going to have employee and beneficiary information, financial information for your employees. If you have client information, you're going to, with a file tree, you're going to want to look there as well. And then you're going to be dealing with unstructured data, things like email, where you're going to have to use a more targeted approach, whether it's, pattern matching analytics to look for emails or other types of data that are going to have that have the potential at least to have sensitive information. So there's not always a one size fits all approach to all of these projects. Sometimes if you're dealing with a healthcare entity and they're covered by HIPAA, your hands may be tied a little bit in terms of how you can address that. And maybe it is, you're going to have to look at every record because there's just going to be a higher percentage of impacted individuals. So, but it's always a conversation about what's the best approach for this type of data and this particular incident.
And I know we're kind of running short our time, and I do want to give some kind of takeaways to the audience, and maybe Karla and James, if you're okay with it, if we can jump to maybe slide 21 on kind of preparations and next steps.
Absolutely.
That works for me.
So I just kind of want to leave the audience with some things that you may want to consider, right, in order to get ready to best position yourself to respond to a data incident. One of the key things that you can do is develop and practice your incident response plan. That is often done with your incident response team, bringing in counsel, bringing in forensics to kind of help you and walk through a data incident to really understand kind of roles and responsibilities in terms of who's going to do what when, and also tackle some thorny questions about, hey, as philosophically as an organization, are we going to make a ransom payment? And if so, when? The other thing that you want to do now is continuing employee training, right? Understanding, from the employees, given the fact that a number of these ransomware incidents or incidents in general derive from phishing attacks. So teaching the employees to understand and recognize potentially malicious emails and what they should do if they do get something like that in their mailbox. Karla, James, anything else on kind of, we can talk a little bit about additional next steps, but anything on this?
Yeah, so again, encourage you all to either get cyber insurance or get familiar with your cyber insurance carrier. Beazley offers proactive services. So, I know I am a quote unquote first responder, but I do a lot of proactive services. So I, help coordinate workshops, tabletop exercises, and reviewed IRP plans on our end. And that's also things that we can help connect insureds with those types of services. There's also discount programs for mock phishing emails and seeing which employees would be susceptible to clicking on phishing emails.
Yeah, and I think there's also just some simple things that you can do as an organization that will really help mitigate the risks. And I'm sure, Karla and Bruce can walk through those things like multi-factor authentication. And so I think it's making sure that you're talking internally as an organization and reaching out to to those who support you on the cyber side to make sure you're doing everything you can to protect yourself before an incident occurs.
Yeah, and another great resource too, guys, is your broker, right? They can also be instrumental in reaching out to your carriers and reaching out to the folks that they have relationships with, whether it's forensic firms or law firms or the ransom negotiations. They are also a tremendous resource for you to get information, and if you do have an incident as well, particularly on the proactive side. Bruce, maybe next slide too as well. So again, thinking about steps that you can take now to reduce the likelihood or the impact. Test your disaster and business continuity plans, ensuring that you do have backups, ensure that your backups are viable. I can't tell you how many times how frustrating it is that people say we've got backups, and whenever they spin them back up, they realize that the backups are corrupted or, they weren't taken. So test your backups and also ensure that they're segmented. Also ensure you got an adequate logging, particularly on those systems that contain sensitive information. And also not only that you're logging, but also you're retaining those logs, because as Karla mentioned before, threat actor may be in your systems for a protracted period of time. And if your logs are rolling off, you don't have that forensic evidence to figure out, how they got in, what they did when they got in. So it's really important to have that adequate logging, because the forensic firm is really limited to the available logs. And also think about endpoint monitoring to the various places that may contain sensitive information. And in the last minute, maybe we can talk about third-party vendors. Bruce, last slide, please. So one of the things, we're seeing a number of third-party incidents that, a ransomware incident happens at a third party that impacts your organization. And really, to a large measure, you are at their mercy in terms of how much support they are giving you. And, have a situation now where we represent a number of smaller healthcare practices that they've utilized a vendor that got hit with ransomware on Halloween. And those systems, here it is, February the 10th, they're still down. Just simply because the vendor has been very slow in terms of getting those systems back up and restored. So it's really important for you to do your due diligence and also look at your contractual relationships in terms of, hey, if you do have an incident, who's going to pay for the cost of investigating an incident? Who's going to pay for the cost of notification? So it's really important to do that due diligence, to have very strong contractual provisions with your vendors, and then also ensure as part of that due diligence, how are vendors maintaining the security of their credentials that may get access to your network. But Karla, James, welcome your thoughts on further thoughts on third-party incidents.
I agree, and especially with the prepare for third-party incidents. And just a quick horror story: I had it insured who they were a law firm. All their data was maintained with their MSP. MSP was hit with a ransomware, and so if you're familiar, they had no access to their client files. I mean, motions that they've spent days and hours working on. And they were their hands were tied until the MSP, the third party, did something. And that process took months to get a decryption tool. And so for months, this solo practitioner was without their data, without access to important critical files, and without any sort of solution there, because their contract did not foresee what would happen in the event the third party was undergoing an incident. So I think that's something now more and more companies who are engaging in these contracts should look into.
Great. Any other questions that you have for us, or Bruce, anything else in the queue?
No, just if there's any questions, if anyone has that, I don't see anything else in the queue. If anyone wants to type. In the meantime, on behalf of the Masters Conference and Consilio, Bruce, Karla, James, thank you very much. This was very informative. We did get a few good discussion notes, so thanks to the folks that shared that. As a reminder, this is being recorded, and a copy will be available on the Masters YouTube page in about a week, and we can email that link to everyone once it becomes available. With that, thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.